Spent for the Lord. Today we're going to look at two young missionaries. The first, America sent overseas to share the gospel, Adoniram and Ann Judson. Ann said this, "A little while and we are in eternity. Before we find ourselves there, let us do much for Christ." So where were they sent? To a little country called Burma. It's not called Burma anymore. I think it's called Myanmar. But back then it was Burma. You see, these missionaries, they were not born brave. None of you children are born into this world being courageous. It is a learned trait, and it's best you start now at a young age. Now, Adoniram grew up in a very strict congregational minister's home in Massachusetts. That's where Rudy and Alini live. And he went to a college called Brown College, and at that time, the French atheistic teachings pervaded, and all his friends were atheists. They said in Yale, every single student was an atheist, except for 4 at that time. And in that college, there was one very charismatic, bright young man named Ernest Ames that Adoniram would attribute his new view on life of atheism to. How do you go from being a Christian to an atheist? Do you children have friends that will lead you into it? This is a very good lesson to us all. Choose your friends wisely. The Bible says, "He that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed." So the faith of your parents is not enough, and Adoniram had to find Christ for himself. So how did he do that? Well, when he was in college and he finished up, he had vanquished all his rivals in intellectual contests. He graduated at 19 from Providence College, now called Brown University, and he was valedictorian. He was very smart. And he entertained the most extravagant ambitions, and his imagination ran wild as he contemplated his future eminence. He pictured himself as an orator and swaying the multitudes with his eloquence, and he saw himself as a gifted writer, writing poetry, and as the second Alexander the Great, weeping because there were no more worlds to conquer. He had quite an ego, this young man. That's not a good thing. But we're learning now how he became a Christian. He set off for college after leaving his closest friend to pursue his dreams, and he joined a band of strolling players. This was a theatrical troupe that traveled the country, and as himself later related, he led a wild and reckless life. And he left this theater troupe after a few weeks, and he went on horseback. Remember, there weren't cars back then. If you wanted to get around, you had to go by horseback or walk or maybe a train. And so he stopped at an inn one night, but the whole inn was full. There was no place for him to sleep. And apologetically, the landlord explained, well, there was one room he could stay in. Only one room was somewhat vacant, and he would have to share it with a young man who was extremely ill, in fact, probably dying. What did Judson say? He said, "I'll take the room. Death has no terrors for me. You see, I'm an atheist." That means, children, you just don't believe there's a God. Well, Judson went to sleep that night, but sleep eluded him. The partition between him and the very sick man was very, very thin, and for long hours he listened to the groans of the dying young man. Groans of agony and groans of despair. The poor fellow is evidently dying in terror. I suppose I should go to his assistance, he thought. But what would I say to help him? And he shivered at the very thought of going into the presence of a dying man. And then he felt a blush of shame steal over him. What would his late unbelieving companions think if they knew of his weakness? Above all, what would the witty, brilliant, atheist Ernest say if he knew? As he tried to compose himself, the dreadful cries from the next room continued. Oh, he pulled those blankets over his head, but he still heard the awful sounds and shuddered. And finally all became quiet in the next room. At dawn, having had no sleep, he rose and inquired of the innkeeper concerning his fellow lodger. He is dead. Dead, replied Judson. And do you know who he was? Yes, the innkeeper answered. He was a graduate of Providence College, a young man named Ernest. He is dead, dead, replied Judson. Judson was overwhelmed by the news that the young man who died the previous night in the adjoining room in evident terror of death was his best college friend, Ernest, who had led him into atheism and infidelity. For many hours, the words, dead, lost, lost, kept ringing in his ears. And now there was just one place that beckoned him. Turning his horse's direction, he went home and begged his father and mother to help him find a faith that would stand the test of life and of death, of time and eternity. So Judson returned home to Massachusetts, and he repented, much like the prodigal son in the Bible to his father. Children, do you remember that story? Oh, that's a good one. And like the prodigal son, he went home and he went to study at Andover Seminary, and he read the work of a missionary by the name of William Carey in India. This influenced him to give serious consideration to the question of foreign missions. You see, back then, America had not sent anyone overseas. In fact, if you were growing up there, nobody would talk about going to far, far away lands. I wonder how he got this desire to go there. It must have been from the Lord. The Lord must have put that in his heart. Now, his first conclusion was that surely the love of Christ, which had so marvelously banished the darkness from his own soul, was meant for all mankind. And by day he was haunted by the vision of vast nations bound and dying in darksome prison house of sin. And by night he spent long sleepless hours contemplating the hapless condition of multitudes beyond the sea sinking into Christless graves. But it was not easy to find and accept his place in the divine program. There was a terrific struggle in his own soul between his worldly ambitions and the claims of the love of Christ. And then one day he went out into the woods, just like the woods where you live, Corbin. He walked down through a pasture. I wonder if he had to walk past cows. But he walked out into those woods and he fell on his knees praying, "More than all else, I long to please thee, my Lord. What wilt thou have me to do?" As he prayed, he felt the presence of Jesus close beside him and heard his voice saying, that still quiet voice, "Go to the uttermost parts and preach the gospel of my love. I send you forth like Paul as a witness to distant nations." And like Paul, he rose up determined not to be disobedient to the Lord's commission. Wonder what was next for this young man. He met this young lady, and within 2 weeks he knew he wanted to marry her. And so he asked to court Anne Hasselstein, the most beautiful girl in Massachusetts. But she was different than him. She had found Jesus as a young girl. When Adoniram asked her to marry, she told him, "Ask her father." And you wouldn't believe the way he asked her father. Listen to the letter that he wrote to ask his daughter's hand in marriage. Now, I'll let you know the punchline. He says yes, but get a load of this. Here's the letter. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure to a heathen land, her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life, whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory, with a crown of righteousness brightened by the acclamations of praise which shall resound to her Savior, from heathens saved through her means from eternal woe and despair? Huh? Is that not hard to believe? The father said, yes. Now, what was Anne's response? Before he wrote that letter, before she'd even met him, she said to God, direct me in thy service. I ask no more. I would not choose my position of work or place of labor. Only let me know thy will, and I will readily comply. Little children, can you say this like young Anne did? Upon engagement, she wrote to a girlfriend, I feel willing and expect, if nothing in Providence prevents, to spend my days in this world, in heathen lands. Oh yes, Lydia, I have about come to the determination to give up all my comforts and enjoyments here, sacrifice my affection to relatives and friends, and go where God, in his providence, shall see fit to place me. And then a few lines down, it says, now my mind is settled and composed, and is willing to leave the event with God. None can support one under trials and afflictions but him. In him alone I feel a disposition to confide. How short is time, how boundless is eternity. If we may be considered worthy to suffer for Jesus here, will it not enhance our happiness hereafter? Oh, pray for me. Spend whole evenings in prayer for those who go to carry the gospel to the poor heathen. She then wrote him back, I rejoice that I am in God's hands, that he is everywhere present and can protect me in one place as well as in another. He has my heart in his hands, and when I am called to face danger, to pass through scenes of terror and distress, he can inspire me with fortitude and enable me to trust him. Jesus is faithful. His promises are precious. And here they are, less than 2 weeks later, setting off to the heathen lands, expecting to die there serving the Lord. They left America to go to India to work as William Carey did, but after arriving in port, the government turned them away. India would not let them enter, but they did not go back. They found another ship, leaving for another place where no missionary had gone before and where no missionary was welcome, and this place was Burma. Now they were told the government had closed it to foreigners, but they knew this was God's leading, and so they caught the ship to Burma. Now, it was a very difficult passage. It had taken many months to even get to India, and they were tossed by a fierce monsoon in the Bay of Bengal and became very ill, almost to death. Her husband alone attended her while she gave birth to her first baby, which soon died and was buried at sea. Oh. They finally reached Burma in 1813. and they started residence in the Felix Carey Mission House. She was so sick, she had to be carried in a stretcher as they disembarked. And it was 2.5 years later that she would ever receive a letter from her parents. And she was living as Adoniram had said she would, a fate he proposed in his letter. When they landed, they arrived in a filthy village with deplorable conditions. You know, there was no running water, no electricity, no washing machines. It was pretty much like living in squalor and in the dirt. The government was also oppressive to both the people, but especially to the white man visiting. And it was forbidden for any Burmese person to become a Christian, for they would be killed. And it was into a jungle infested with tigers, sweltering heat over 100 degrees, and high humidity. Many died of tropical diseases. Life was very, very hard. And it was very hostile to them there. And although the natives were not cannibals, it was as dangerous for them to share the gospel. They would be killed, just not eaten. Does that give you any comfort? Instead of witch doctors like John Patton dealt with, they stood up against the Buddhist priest who kept the people in darkness. Now, Adoniram, he had some passions, and I want to ask you, children, what are your favorite things? What is the thing you're most passionate about? You see, this young missionary, he had two passions. One was translating the scriptures into the language of the Burmese people. And his second passion and prayer was to lead individuals to know Christ in his transforming power and live to see 100 converts. With great tact and zeal, he preached by the roadside. Years went by without a single convert, but he refused to be discouraged. One day he got a letter from the mission board, and they asked him about his deplorable lack of results and inquired concerning the prospects. And he simply replied this one line: "The prospects are as bright as the promise of God." After a while, he started preaching the gospel in public. In order to make friends with the Burmese people, he would have to make a zayat for them. Now, why would he have to do that? Because the weather there was sweltering hot and it would rain all the time. So they built these little kind of open air enclosures that would protect them from the rain and offer them a place to get up off the muddy ground, and they could sit and talk and have tea. And so this was a large public building where farmers and businessmen would gather to talk and relax. Finding a spot on the busy road, he made the zayat. And when the travelers found out the white man was not charging like the other Burmese people did, they soon became very friendly. And this was how he got them to come hear the gospel. So he built this small little zayat chapel on the roadside. Now, there were many disappointments, but 6 years of effort and fervent supplication finally rewarded him one convert. He says, "We proceeded to a large pond, the bank of which is graced with an enormous image of Buddha, and there administered baptism to Maung Nao, the first Burman convert. Oh, may it prove the beginning of a series of baptism in the Burman Empire, which shall continue in uninterrupted succession to the end of time," he wrote in his journal that day. Now, the first convert had a very interesting story. He was in a zayat accepting the words of life along with the other men when the priest came up and told the people that they had to stop listening to this white man preach. The Buddhist priest turned to a learned man, a Buddhist teacher, and said, "Why are you here? You know better being a Buddhist teacher. Go, do not come back." And you see the priest giving the missionary a very hard time here. And then he turns to the little fisherman. And to the little fisherman he said, "Why are you here? You are just a fisherman. You cannot understand spiritual matters. Let us be the judges of religion. You go fish. Does that sound familiar? Have any of us heard this before? But this fisherman did not stop learning of Jesus. He kept coming back. And then he asked to be baptized, knowing it would be his death sentence. Little children, do you remember the verse in the Bible? I will make you fishers of men. And so he did. Time goes on, and the government went to war with Britain, seeking freedom from them. The Judsons became afraid because the missionaries were being accused of being spies and killed. The king had declared, you cannot share the gospel. The Judsons were afraid of this king. But then that brave little fisherman came to them and said, you are listening to the wrong king. So the Judsons decided to go to the king and share the gospel of the true king so they could stay in Burma. And here we see our missionary with another missionary before the emperor of Burma, asking to share the gospel to his people. What do you think the king did? He threw them out. But the Judsons stayed, and for years Adoniram worked tirelessly to translate the scriptures into Burmese. It took many, many years. And then in 1824 begins the story of unbelievable punishments. In their little home, Adoniram was thrown to the floor, dragged away, put in prison. Leaving his translations, he'd labored for years in the house with his pregnant wife, Ann. So you've got to remember, children, these people, they had never read a Bible, and that's what he was doing for them, trying to give them a Bible in their language so they could read about Jesus. And he wondered, as he was being dragged off, what would become of his translations, the gospel in the language of the people, and what would become of his wife Ann and the baby she would soon deliver. He was thrown into one dark, filthy room. He was forbidden to speak to 50 fellow prisoners except rarely, and they didn't give him water or fresh clothing. The fellow prisoners were whipped and were often led forth at 3 p.m. for execution. He never knew what day would be his last. It was one of the world's most horrible 17 months of imprisonment. From 1824 to 1825, at age 37, little food was given to him. His feet were bound to a large bamboo pole, his hands to another, and at night his feet were lifted higher than his head, and thus he was to swing suspended on the small of his back, his feet tied to the raised pole. Fellow prisoners were whipped, and as we said, led to execution. He was bound during 9 months of this suffering with 3 pairs of fetters. 2 months, they gave him 5 pairs. His sufferings from fever, heat, hunger, disappointments, cruelties was very challenging. On one occasion, pitifully weak and emaciated, they drove him in chains across the sand until his back lacerated, his feet were in blisters, and he fell to the ground and prayed for death. For 2 years he was incarcerated in a prison too vile to house animals. The stench of the place was terrible. Vermin, children, that's those little rats, crawled everywhere. And the jailer, his name was Mr. Spotted Face, was a brute in human form. You see, the prison guards had once been murderers set free from prison to serve as guards. So they weren't very kind. He would have fallen except for the tender, persistent ministrations, that means the care of his wife, Ann. She would bribe the jailer under the cover of darkness, almost daily creep to the door of Judson's den, bringing a little bit of food and whispering words of hope. The government had been looking for anything Adoniram had written. What seemed to be a clever plan occurred to Ann. She would hide the translations in a pillow, and having done this, she brought the pillow to the prison. Now, you would think she would have buried him in the ground, but that wouldn't have worked in a place where it rained all the time. The translations would have been destroyed. What a clever plan, to put the translations and give them to the prisoner. Who would ever think to look there? And no one dreamed that the white man's head rested at night on the most precious of all treasures, the Word of God. Then came a crushing misfortune. Taking a fancy to the pillow, the jailer grabbed it and kept it as his own. Judson's spirit groaned within him. What an irreparable loss! But Ann's ingenuity was not yet exhausted. Having made a prettier, nicer pillow, she brought it to the prison, and her husband said to the jailer, "How would you like to exchange the old soiled pillow for this bright new one?" Mr. Spotted Face readily agreed, wondering at the odd taste of the white man. Thus the precious manuscripts were recovered. Now, he was thankful to have his translation safe as he slept on it, but it was of no good to the people unless they could study it for themselves. Many times, smitten down with disease and at death's door, he breathed out this prayer: "O Lord, let me finish my work. Spare me just long enough to put thy saving words into the hands of a perishing people." The prayer was answered. Ingenious Ann, again she comes to the rescue. A caged lion was being starved to death so that they could turn him loose on those prisoners. Amazing how good God was to save them from the lion. The lion starved to death before they could do that. But what did Ann do? She cleaned out the cage and then got permission to get her husband moved into it so he could get some fresh air in the cage left outside to recover. How about that? While her husband was in this prison, he took the Lord's Prayer and made a beautiful little hymn out of it and would sing it for comfort at night. Ann worked tirelessly, pleading for help from the missionary board and the Burmese government to release her husband. Finally, he was released. Upon release from this servitude, his one thought was, "Is Ann still alive?" It had been 3 weeks since Ann had come to bring him hope and some food. Upon reaching the room where he knew she was last, he saw a fat, half-naked Burmese woman squatting in the ashes beside a pan of coals, holding on her knees an emaciated baby, so begrimed with dirt that it did not occur to him that it was his own. Across the foot of the bed lay a human object who at first glance was no more recognizable than his child. The face was pale, the body shrunken to the last degree of emaciation. Black curls had all been shorn from the bald head. It was Ann, who roused from her stupor as warm tears fell upon her face. Nursed slowly back to health, the Judsons transformed their headquarters to Lower Burma. Now the Judsons were reunited, but they were so sick. They had undergone some of the worst brutality, and they were starving. And his translations that he spent years translating were gone. You see, when they opened up the prison doors and let him out, he couldn't take his pillow with him. The guard kept it. But that little fisherman, he went back to that prison and looked for the pillow. And he found the pillow outside the prison. The guard had thrown it out after they took him away because he just didn't like it. So her husband was able to finish and give the translations to the Burmese. The war was over. He could now freely preach, and the Burmese could become Christians. And here you see him preaching to the Burmese people. But you know there was a great cost to this. Ann fell victim to another fever, and this time it proved to be too vicious. Her husband was gone on a missionary work, and before she died, she said, "The teacher, my husband, is long in coming, and the new missionaries are long in coming. I must die alone, and leave my little one. But as it is the will of God, I acquiesce in his will. Children, what do you think that word, acquiesce, means? It means a complete surrender and acceptance of the will of God. She died at peace, even though she was alone, even though she was leaving her little baby alone, and her husband was not with her. Don't you want that kind of peace in this world? No matter what happens, you acquiesce. Anne died in 1826 when she was not yet 37 years of age. When her husband returned, his heart was broken, and he buried his wife under a hopia tree. 3 months later, he buried his third child next to Anne. And then he went into the jungles all by himself, and he spent a year there, and they marveled he was not eaten by the tigers. Such great loss and heartache, losing your beloved wife after 14 years and your 3 children, and he survived the jungles alone because the love that never fails sustained him. We will need this kind of love. He said, if I had not felt certain that every additional trial was ordered by the infinite love and mercy, I could not have survived my accumulated sufferings. Judson joined with Paul in declaring, the love of Christ constraineth me. Therefore I will glory in reproaches, in persecution, and distresses for Christ's sake. In time, the epic drama of the Judson story inspired generations of missionaries. Anne's writings, which she wrote prolifically during those 14 years, were among the first at a popular level to stir up missionary interest among the Protestant population in America and beyond. Her memoir was printed soon after her death and ran through many editions. She was the childhood heroine of Adoniram's second and third wives. In 1850, a 10-year-old American girl, Sarah Hall, wept when she heard of the death of Anne's baby Roger, and she wrote a poem to mark the sad event. Little did she know that 18 years later, she would become the second Mrs. Judson. The epic drama of the Judson story inspired generations of missionaries. In 1828, a 12-year-old factory girl, Emily Chibuk, was moved to tears by reading of the death of baby Maria. 18 years later, she would become the third Mrs. Judson. Emily said to a friend before meeting him, I have felt ever since I read the memoir of Mrs. Ann Judson when I was a small child that I must become a missionary. It is my hope, children, each of you will have the same desire, to go wherever God will send you, to trust him so completely. What happened to Mr. Judson? Into the deep. Judson became critically ill in the spring of 1850, and it was believed that his only hope of recovery lay in taking a long sea voyage. I want to know who thought that one up. The stricken missionary was carried on board by his weeping converts, and when the ship, after certain delays, sailed several days later, he was accompanied only by Mr. Thomas Rainey. On April 12, 1850, he breathed his last, and on the same day his body was buried at sea. It would be 4 months before Emily would learn of his death. To sum up this beautiful these lives that were spent for the Lord, Adoniram Judson ended up spending 37 years on the mission field in Burma, and during that time he persevered through 17 months of brutal imprisonment, several bouts of life-threatening illness, and the death of 2 wives and 6 children. He succeeded in translating the Bible into Burmese. It is the same Bible the Burmese people have today, and compiling an English-Burmese dictionary. He waited 6 years for his first Burmese convert, and although his goal was 100 souls, he only baptized himself 18. But by the time of his death in 1850, there were 100 Burmese churches, 8,000 Burmese Christians. How beautiful. And if you want to know more, these are 3 great books.
Wow.